There are people whose lives constitute an argument, not a rhetorical argument, not a debate point, but an argument in the deeper sense, a demonstration, a proof by example that certain things are possible and that the limits that others accept as natural are, in fact, chosen. Paul Robeson's life was that kind of argument. It was also a tragedy of the specific American variety, the tragedy of a country that produces, occasionally and almost accidentally, a person of extraordinary gifts and extraordinary conscience, and then sets about systematically destroying what it cannot contain. Paul Leroy Robeson was born on April 9, 1898, in Princeton, New Jersey, the son of William Drew Robeson, a man who had escaped slavery at the age of 15 by running away through the Underground Railroad, and who had, in the decades after his escape, built a life of such dignity and purpose that his son would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it. The father's example was not incidental to the son's story. It was the foundation of it. Paul Robeson grew up knowing what it meant to refuse the terms that a hostile world offered, to insist on the full measure of one's humanity in a society that preferred a diminished version, to carry oneself with the specific, undefeatable dignity of a man who has decided that the opinion of his oppressors is not a relevant data point. He excelled at everything. This is not a simplification or a biographical convenience. It is the literal truth about a man whose range of genuine achievement across genuinely different fields has no parallel in the history of American public life. He attended Rutgers University on a scholarship and was valedictorian of his graduating class. He was a four-sport varsity athlete: football, baseball, basketball, track. And in football, he was named an All-American, twice, by Walter Camp, which is the most authoritative recognition the sport offered. He earned a law degree from Columbia University. He spoke eventually more than 20 languages with varying degrees of fluency. He was, by any measure and in any field, at the top of whatever he was doing. He came to performance, to the stage, and then to the concert hall, and then to film. Not as a man who had found his calling, but as a man who had found one more field in which he could excel, and in which, it turned out, his particular instrument was something the world had not encountered before. The voice, a bass-baritone of such depth and such warmth and such physical presence that audiences described it in terms that reach for geological metaphors because the ordinary musical vocabulary is insufficient. The sound of the earth, the sound of a river, the sound of something that predates the specific human moment and will outlast it. He had not trained it in the conventional sense. It was simply what his voice was, refined by use and performance into something that no training could have produced because it came from a combination of physical instrument and interior life that was entirely his own. Showboat gave him Old Man River in 1928 on Broadway, and the song became his, not in the possessive sense of ownership, but in the deeper sense of identification, of a voice and a lyric finding each other with a completeness that made all subsequent versions feel like approximations. He sang it as a man who understood the specific weight of the words from the inside, who knew what it meant to be the person the river doesn't care about, who brought to the performance the full history of what it had meant to be black in America and what it continued to mean, and who did so not with bitterness, but with a tragic grandeur that was the most honest form of the feeling available. The films followed: The Emperor Jones, Showboat on Film, Sanders of the River, King Solomon's Mines. He was a genuine film star of international reputation, beloved in Europe, in Britain and France and the Soviet Union, with a warmth and a completeness that the American industry, constrained by its own racial politics, was not always able to match. He moved between continents with the ease of a man who had discovered that the world was larger than the country that had produced him and who found, in other places, a quality of recognition that his own country withheld. He found it most completely in the Soviet Union, which would become the most complicated element of his legacy. The embrace of a political system that he experienced as egalitarian in its treatment of him, and that was, for the millions of people living under it, something considerably less than egalitarian. His sympathy for the Soviet experiment was genuine and was based in the real experience of being treated as a full human being in Moscow at a time when Washington could not manage the same. The sympathy was also, as history has made clear, applied to a system that did not deserve it. He was not naive. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence who had made a political judgment that his enemies used to destroy him, and that history has not fully vindicated. The complexity is real and must be acknowledged rather than simplified in either direction. The United States government revoked his passport in 1950. The decision was made without formal charges, without trial, without the due process that the Constitution guaranteed and that the government found inconvenient when applied to a black man of socialist sympathies who had the temerity to speak at international peace conferences and to suggest, publicly and repeatedly, that American foreign policy was not identical with human progress. Without a passport, he could not travel. Without the ability to travel, he could not perform internationally, where his audiences were largest and his income most reliable. His records were removed from library shelves. His name was struck from the record books, the All-American selections, the Rutgers honors, the athletic achievements, simply removed as if they hadn't occurred. He was heard in America only through his recordings and through the occasional concert that organizers brave enough to host him could arrange, including the Peekskill concerts of 1949, where the combination of his presence and the political moment produced violence, organized violence, from mobs that attacked concert-goers, that the local and state authorities declined to prevent. The government that had revoked his passport was not troubled by the violence, it was troubled by the man. His passport was restored in 1958, 8 years after it had been taken, following a Supreme Court ruling that the State Department had exceeded its authority. He toured. He performed. The voice was still there, diminished somewhat by age and by the years of forced inactivity, but recognizable, still carrying the specific weight of the man who had given it its meaning. He was received in Britain and in the Soviet Union and in much of the world as the major figure he was. In America, the reception was more complicated, as it had always been. He retired in 1963, after a period of declining health that included a breakdown in Moscow, whose full circumstances have never been entirely clear. He lived quietly in Philadelphia with his sister, largely withdrawn from public life, until his death on January 23, 1976. He was 77 years old. He had been, across a life of extraordinary range and extraordinary cost, the most complete argument that 20th century America produced for the proposition that talent and conscience are not separate qualities, but the same quality expressed in different registers. He sacrificed his career for his conscience. The sacrifice was real, and it was enormous, and it was made by a man who understood exactly what it would cost, and who made it anyway, because the alternative, the compliant, contained, officially approved version of Paul Robeson that the government wanted, was not Paul Robeson at all. The voice that could move mountains was silenced by a passport office. The mountains are still there. So is the voice